types first, we really do not get a very good understanding of the antitype. In this case, it will be the Holy Spirit. Yes, Steve?
Tabernacle was to remind the Jews once they got into the promised land of their wilderness wandering.
Yes. Steve says the purpose of the Feast of the Tabernacles is also called the Feast of Booths. It is also referred to the Feast of Ingathering. It comes in the fall of the year. And
Feast of Ingathering was Pentecost.
no, it's in the fall, not in the spring. It's in the fall when they brought the crops in. So anyway, when we look at the situation that we have here, we begin to understand how God is teaching his people. He teaches them first by types, then by antitypes. So when we understand the types, then we're prepared to understand the message. Because we're into spiritual realities here. So let's begin so far by looking at John 7, verses 11 through 13. We already read verse 10, where Jesus goes up in secret. Notice there's controversy associated with Jesus. Then the Jews sought him at the feast and said, "Where is he?" And there was much complaining among the people concerning him. Some said, "He is good." Others said, "No, on the contrary, he deceives the people." However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. Now, let's get straight. Anytime you mention Jesus, you introduce controversy. Jesus is a type of character that people cannot be indifferent about. Either he's who he claims to be, or he's a fraud. And people are wrestling with this. This is always the case as he's being presented in the world. We see it in our own culture. We have people that don't even want the name of Jesus mentioned. Well, it's all right to mention other people, tyrants and that type, but don't mention Jesus. They are offended by that name. At least they say they are. Now, we have this type of situation in Jerusalem because there are various groups that are present. And what gets confusing is they're all referred to as being Jews. But the word Jew is being used different ways. The term Jews refers to the religious authorities in the region. The leaders of this group are called the chief priests and the Pharisees. The Jews could refer to the governing body, which would be the Sanhedrin. What sect were the Sadducees over? Yeah, chief priests. Yeah, that's right. They were. So you had the chief priests were mainly Sadducees. And they were always at each other's throats with the Pharisees. And they had some very basic theological differences, including the resurrection and life after death and angels and all that type of thing. And now, as Steve has let out, we're going to be talking about the Holy Spirit. I'm sure the Sadducees don't have much use for that. They were the materialists of their day, like a lot of people are today. If I can't see it, if I can't touch it and smell it and so on, then it doesn't exist. And philosophy, logical positivism, and which is really a pretty wild assumption when you come right down to it. Then you had Jewish families who made their homes in Jerusalem, were also there. We read about that in verse 25 of John chapter 7. And then we read about the crowds, the multitudes, which were mixed, and they were present from the feast. And remember, when you're talking about this group of people, mostly they had come there from outside of Palestine, which would tell you what?
Gentiles.
No, not necessarily. No, it wouldn't be Gentiles. What would it be? What about their exposure to Jesus?
Would be much greater.
Would it?
Well,
Jesus never stepped out of Palestine.
That's true.
Their probably was open to Jesus. They already-
Yes, because they're learning about Jesus. You see, and then you have Jews, religious establishment, and so on, that have already developed a hardened heart against Jesus. They're going to reject him no matter what he does, no matter what he says. And then you have people who are certainly open. This is also called the Feast of Booths. It lasted 7 days. And in time, it turned into 8 days because the last day happened to be a solemn Sabbath day. It had historical significance because it represented the days of Israelites wandering in the wilderness. It had agricultural significance because it was a harvest festival after the main crops were in. And consequently, in Exodus chapter 23 and verse 16, it was called the Feast of Ingathering. If we were to compare this feast, and I say feast or festival, what national holiday would it most likely correspond with us today? Thanksgiving. In other words, it was a joyful occasion. It was a happy occasion. That's why it's called a festival as well as a feast. It's not just eating. That's what we usually think about feast. It was a whole week of activity. Yes, Brother Miller?
So, in all actuality, it came after Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Atonement. This would become later.
Yes. The Day of Atonement.
Day of Atonement.
The Day of Atonement is less than a week before that.
Actually, 2 weeks.
Well, was it 2? I thought it was only 1 week. But
I'm sure, guys.
uh,
You gotta wait, you gotta wait.
But it came later on in the fall.
yeah, it came before the Feast of Tabernacles. That's why I said earlier, some people say that there are only 3 feasts. There are only 3 feasts here. Because they will take the Day of Atonement and join it with the Feast of Tabernacles, because the people are there already for the Day of Atonement.
Okay.
So they'll say, well, there are 3 main feasts, and they just include the Day of Atonement with the Feast of Tabernacles.
So in other words, the Day of Atonement is a solemn holiday for them to reunite with God, and then after that feast, after that holiday, then they go into the feast to rejoice after the Day of Atonement. Am I understanding that right?
If I understand you properly, I was sort of distracted. I apologize to you, Brother Miller. Actually, I think perhaps one of the best descriptions of this feast being observed is when the book of Nehemiah describes it after the captivity. And if you'd like to see how they restored that feast, by the way, this feast had not been observed since the days of Joshua. See what was happening? That was one of the reasons why the people had gone into captivity. They were not keeping the law. So if you want to read a little bit more about it, I suggest you take a look at Nehemiah 8, beginning with verse 13, and read through chapter 9 and verse 3. We won't take time to do that this morning because, well, I'm sorry, what did you say, Steve?
Exodus 23. You should keep the feast of unleavened bread 7 days, which is verse 15. Then you shall keep the feast of harvest at your cost, acknowledging the first fruits of the toil of the field. So the first fruits was your cost. You should keep the feast of gathering of foods, and they get harvest.
Yeah, but we're talking about in the fall of the year, right here. Unless you want to change the date of the Day of Atonement, which, Yom Kippur, right? Mm-hmm. It does not happen in the spring. It happens in the fall.
So Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
So if we have time at the end of the notes here, maybe we can take a look at Nehemiah chapter 8 and see how Nehemiah was instrumental in restoring this feast. So during the festival, the Jews lived outdoors in booths. These were little huts. They were temporary structures that they made with their own hands. They just grabbed sticks and palm tree leaves and all that type of thing, whatever they could find. And again, when you read Nehemiah, you see exactly how this was done. And they lived in those huts for 7 days or for a week. And so the structures were located in streets, rooftops, and around the temple. And during the week, they did everything in these structures to commemorate how God provided for their ancestors during the 40 years of wanderings. So, who do you suppose were in these huts? That's right. They were family. These were family huts. And guess what they were focused upon while they were in those huts? As families, what were they doing?
Reenacting what their family went through
Yeah, they're not just reenacting, but they're teaching their children. They're expressing, this is what our forefathers went through. And so why would they be in huts then? Well, that's the way they existed in the wilderness. But what was the lesson that they were supposed to learn from living in the huts? You know, we can get all caught up into the particulars and this particular detail, and it had to be done this way and for so many days and so on. And we completely miss the significance of the action. That's right. Steve hit it right on the nail. This is the way that they teach their children how they had to rely upon God, and God cared for them while they were in the wilderness. And that's why you're going to see light and water being demonstrated during this week. And you might even start thinking in your own minds what the significance of some of the actions that they did during that week. You know, this is really a wonderful way of teaching children. You teach them, you tell them, but they actually experience it. It's not a period of suffering or self-denial. This is a festival. It is a time of rejoicing, a time of happy remembrance of God's protective care of them. It's preservation. and which they experienced in the heat of the desert and in the storms. I have several passages here that we could read. The psalmist refers to this just briefly in Psalm 27 and verse 5, and again in Psalm 31 and verse 20. But the one I find most interesting is found in the book of Isaiah. Let's take a look at that. You know, as I read about this feast, and I'm reminded about it time and time again, I have to look at myself and say, how often do I really thank God for what I have? I mean, we always want to approach God in prayer about our complaints and the things that we don't have. But this was a week in which God's people expressed their appreciation, their thanksgiving to their provider. I ask myself, can I do any less than that? Let's turn to Isaiah chapter 4, I believe is what I came up with, 4 and verse 6. Of course, Isaiah's actually during the time of the captivity, but let's see what we have here. And it says, and there shall be a tabernacle for shade in the daytime from the heat, for a place of refuge, and for a shelter from storm and rain. Now, Isaiah prophesies obviously after the wilderness wanderings. But he also prophesies before our reading today. So God's people are being prepared through this festival for the ultimate blessing of God that's going to come. And we will see that in verse 39. Yes, Brother Suresh?
Just not telling or reciting the story to the children of the families of Israel. Nehemiah made them live in those huts. Unless
That's
you
right.
live or feel for yourself, you wouldn't understand the depth of what forefathers.
That is exactly right. It's not the situation that we're experiencing this very moment, sitting in padded pews. You see, we're not just talking about it or trying to remember some details here. Learning comes through living. Many years ago, a congregation that was responsible when we had Vacation Bible School had some problems with people because of what we used to call the story room. There won't be very many of you that Mary Ann will remember. I think Brother Suresh might remember it. In which during Vacation Bible School would take Bible stories and we would act them out. And the children would play the parts. And after a while, there was controversy in this congregation that helped us with that. It was a new concept for me. I never understood until I got to thinking about, well, how else do you teach children? Unless it becomes part of them and they live it out. Well, they had some brethren at that congregation that wanted this to be stopped. And one of the elders came to me and said, we have a problem here. We'd like for you to speak on that. I said, okay. So I came down and on Sunday morning, and the preacher at the time, he was right with me on this. It was really troubling him because of objection. Come find out, you know why they objected to it? Because the denominations did it. And therefore it had to be wrong. Yeah. And I'm sitting there with my songbook in my hand. I said, how many of these songs did we write? You know, I thought, what in the, does everything that a denomination do, is it wrong? And guess what I used to demonstrate the scripturalness of using the story room? The Feast of Tabernacles. You see, when you read this, you're also learning how to teach your children. You just don't sit there and lecture to them, and you have them participate so that it becomes part of them. And these children would identify with their Jewish heritage. And they would know who they are. They are the people of God. And God has always preserved his people. Well, does God do that today?
Yes.
Does he do that for you and me?
Yes.
But it was so sad that I had to, and afterwards, there was still controversy after I presented the lesson. The preacher, right afterwards, he went out and he showed some of the things he had. He was so excited about the lesson, but I still got resistance because it. And I sit there. I didn't say anything, and basically it came down to, well, I just don't like it. So, okay. Well, the feast began on the 15th day of Tishri, which is the 7th month. That does put us in the fall, which was 5 days after the Day of Atonement, and it lasted 7 days. Leviticus 23:36, Deuteronomy 16. There are quite a few references to this, as well as Ezekiel 45. 70 bulls were sacrificed. Our lesson plan today, the first part is my research. This part they supplied to us. I wasn't even aware of this before preparing for this lesson, but it says 70 bulls were sacrificed representing the 70 nations of the earth. The ceremonies involved 446 priests and the number of Levites. I thought, well, weren't the priests Levites? Yeah. But not all Levites were priests. So it also included other Levites that were not priests, is what we're being told. 21 trumpets were sounded in the temple courts. A huge candelabrum was hung in the court of women to represent how the forefathers were guided in the wilderness by the pillar of fire. When did they see the fire? During the night, that's right. So the people were never left in darkness, were they? God's presence is with them. And so at night, men danced in the torchlight. And this was the most joyful of the Jewish feast. Now, you've got the light. Now we have water. And the daily water ritual happened at the beginning of each day. White-robed priests would lead a procession of celebrants from the temple down to the pool of Siloam, the main water source of the city. A priest would hold up a gold pitcher and then fill it with the water from the pool. And people would cry, "With joy we draw water out of the wells of salvation." Isaiah 12 and verse 3. Holding the pitcher above his head, the priest would lead the people back to the temple, and the people would chant Psalms 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, and 118. This was part of the ceremony. And they would be greeted by trumpet blast when entering the gates. The priests would then pour the water at the base of the altar of burnt offerings, and the people would shout praises and trumpets would blast. What do you think is the significance of the water? They're very good, very good. It's how God supplied water to the people in the wilderness. They were in waterless places, weren't they? So they totally had to depend upon God. God made sure that they recognized their dependence upon Him. And so we have light and water in the observance of both, for both commemorated God's protection during the wilderness wanders. The pillar of light protected them at night, and God supplied them life-giving water in the wilderness. The things that they needed in order to sustain life. But remember, this is merely a temporary provision, isn't it? Even the manna was temporary. But what Jesus is about to offer is permanent.
But that, what happened in Turkey, they were always, people that survived, they're still talking about the water. They had to have the water, they didn't have enough food, but they lived.
Yeah, you can't live very long, Sister Wells, without water. That's the first. That's even more important than food. But of course, eventually you'll have to have food too. Well, now we have the significant events of the feast. My goodness, I'll tell you, I have quite a few notes here, but what we need to do is read verses 14 through 36 of John chapter 7. And as we read, pay attention very purposely so that you can see what you can pull out yourself. I could give you a lot more details, but this certainly presents to us a beautiful picture. So let's begin with verse 14. It says, "Now about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. And the Jews marveled, saying, 'How does this man know letters, having never studied?'" Well, who do you think would make a statement like that? The out-of-towners, right? Because they've already been, the priests and so on in the city have already been impressed by that. Okay? Jesus answered them and said, "My doctrine is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone wills to do his will, he shall know concerning the doctrine whether it is from God or whether I speak on my own authority. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. Did not Moses give you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me?" Now, let's pause there for a moment. Not everybody understands that they're trying to kill Jesus. Yes, there are people that are trying to, but these out-of-towners, they don't know anything about this evil plot going on. Who's trying to kill you? You know? Well, they just don't know. And so then verse 30 says, "Therefore they sought to take him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come." What did we say Jesus was on? What did we say that Jesus was on? He's on a timetable. It's not time. He's going to do it in his time. He's in control of the situation. They are not. And many of the people believed in him and said, "When the Christ comes, will he do more signs than these which this man has done?" I'm sure that was to the chagrin of the religious establishment in Jerusalem. They did not want to hear that. The Pharisees heard the crowd murmuring these things concerning him, and the Pharisees and the chief priests sent officers to take him. Man, we've got to stop this and stop it right now. these people should not be allowed to see Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, I shall be with you a little while longer, and then I go to him who sent me. What is he referring to here? Yeah, his ascension back into heaven, yes. And he says, you will seek me and not find me, and where I am, you cannot come. Then the Jews said among themselves, where does he intend to go that we cannot find him? Does he intend to go into the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? In other words, is he going to go outside of Palestine? You have to understand their thought processes here. That's where a lot of these people came from. What is this thing that he said, you will seek me and not find me, and where I am, you cannot come? Well, he's going to be getting into the fact that they do not keep the law. And then he'll show that there were certain situations with that law that in order to keep it, certain things had to be put aside. And so they would accuse him of healing on the Sabbath. And yet at the same time, when he says, and you do not keep the law, they circumcised on the Sabbath. And that's why we're going to be looking at why does he mention circumcision? And it'll all come back to the point that they never did understand why God gave the Sabbath to begin with. And consequently, they failed to keep it. Even though they came up with all kinds of stringent regulations concerning how to keep the Sabbath. You know, that can happen in the church today just as well. We can be concerned so deeply about doing everything exactly right, and God never does criticize us for wanting to do things right. Okay, let's get that out in the open. But when our thinking becomes rather skewed, and we don't see the purpose or understand what God is trying to teach us, it ends up that we don't do what God wants us to do in the end. And so that's why it's important for us not just to learn facts and memorize them, but to see how the things that we are reading applies to me and applies to you. And how does that change my life? Yes,
But that's exactly what the Pharisees and Sadducees did. They enforced the law to their way of thinking, not to the way it actually is.
that's right.
They were more concerned with their own power than the actual Word of God and what the law stood for.
Well, I think just about every time when you analyze the situation, it is that they, in the end, will put themselves before God. It's about me first. And we say, well, we can see it in the denominations about us, but is that not also possible among us?
Yep.
So we need to be aware of it. Well, as I said, there's quite a bit more that we can say. I just sort of summarized it, but we ran out of time. And we're staying on schedule here. And Wednesday night, we're going to be getting into the whole point of this whole discussion of the whole chapter. And that is, of course, the living water. Remember, John has already introduced living water earlier. Where was it?
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. With whom?
So there's a woman
With the Samaritan woman.
community of God talking to
Yes,
invest from living water.
absolutely. And so in verse 38, he says, from his heart will flow rivers of living water. And that is probably the greatest blessing Christians, I would say it is the greatest blessings that Christians receive, right there. You say, well, it talks about the wells of salvation. Yeah, this is a salvation issue. Let's recognize it for what it is. Well, our time is gone, and it's been so good for us to go over this. Wednesday night, we will get into the core of our study. Very good.